Let's turn our attention to the glasses. So I can hide the hoodie object. Well, actually, now that it's multiple objects, I should probably create a collection. Also, I didn't name the drawstrings properly. So instead of .r001, we'll call it .l. And then under clothing, let's create a new collection, call it hoodie, and move everything relevant to the hoodie into that collection. Okay, now we can easily disable it and unhide our glasses in the viewport and at render time. We're also going to need the head because we're going to see through the lenses and we need to see the eyes on the other side. So we'll re-enable that collection. And once again, it reveals that at some point in this process, I moved some stuff around. So for whatever reason, the glasses are also moved vertically. I think maybe it's only slightly higher. Let's move it down and make sure we don't penetrate the nose too much. And I think that's correct. Yeah, the earpieces are sitting behind the ears. Nice. So I really wish I could remember when this happened. But silly mistakes, everybody makes them. And let's take a look at our materials. If I remember correctly, we created 2 slots, a placeholder for the frame material, and then in the second slot is the glasses lens material so that we could see through the lenses in the viewport. So we can select slot 2 and only affect the lens part of the mesh, which is an ideal setup. So I'll go into our camera view and we need to Control B, select a new render region right around the glasses. And first I should render without the glasses for comparison. So let's disable the glasses at render time and render an initial version without them. All right, so something you did not see there is when I started the render, if you were watching super closely, you would have noticed that we were using this environment texture, but I realized that's not the one I wanted. I want to be using this bottom one because it provides a little more useful information in terms of reflections when it comes to the glasses. And so this result is using that environment. Again, just in case you're following super closely. And let's get back to the lenses. So I'll switch the viewport to rendered view. And I'm going to show you 2 approaches to lenses. One is seemingly the most physically accurate and also the easiest to set up. Using the principled BSDF, we'll just take the base color from 0.8 in value all the way up to 1. So pure white there. We'll take the specular down to about 0.2. We'll come back to the roughness because it directly affects the transmission, which is the transparent refractive characteristic of the material. So we'll take transmission all the way up to 1, and now we get a cloudy pair of glasses lenses because our roughness is pretty high. I'm going to set that all the way down to 0 for maximum clarity in the lenses. And so this is very easy to set up. And then the only thing to double check is the index of refraction. We can easily look that up and find out what the index is for glass. So we'll go to Google and type in glass IOR. And we've got a convenient list at pixelandpoly.com. If we go to common materials, glass is 1.5. All right, so let's plug that in. Probably won't change much since we're already at 1.45, but 1.5. And conceptually, this material should be ideal in terms of physical accuracy. And we can orbit around the viewport to see if the refractions are noticeable. All right, you should be able to see the silhouette of the cheek kind of change and refract through the lens. It also might help since we've got transparent world, we have this checker pattern in the background, but through the transparent material, we see the world environment. And so in our render settings under film, we need to check transparent glass. And so, I want to see if there's any evidence. Here we go. In the refractions, we can see that the cheek starts this contour and then quickly shifts over. That's evidence of refraction. However, our lenses aren't extremely high powered. So, the higher your prescription, the more distorted your face is through the lens. But the way we've modeled this, it's a little more subtle. Here's an example where you can see it a little more clearly. But honestly, I don't want the refractions to be that extreme. And you'll see why when we talk about the second version of this material. Let's do a render comparison of how the lens is now. Make sure to re-enable our glasses renderability and go back to solid view and switch to slot 2 and render image. Okay, let's see the before and after. No glasses, glasses. And the biggest thing that I notice is just how much the eyes are in shadow now. Before, there was nothing to cast a shadow, so it's maximum illumination. But after glasses, I mean, don't you feel the shadows are really dark? I always do when I get to this point with a portrait that has glasses. And for me, this really bothers me because you witness just how much effort we put into the eyes. And I think this is a big downgrade from how it was before, right? We have these nice, sharp glints of reflection in the eyes. And then not only is it darkened, but the reflections are lessened as well. In fact, this one over here is very flat feeling. So using the principled BSDF this way, as far as I understand the material, again, this should be an ideal glass material, the way we've set it up. But I'm suspicious that something's not kind of wrong on the back end of the material. And so the next thing I like to try, we'll switch to slot 3, is to essentially turn off shadows for this material. The way we can do it is adding an input light path node. I think we've used this before on another material in this project, but in case I haven't, this is a way that we can control the light paths that Cycles uses. And specifically in this case, we can tell the shadow ray, the shadow part of the calculation for this specific material, to be something other than the principled BSDF. So we can add an input, or rather shader, transparent BSDF, which is not refractive, it's just purely transparent. Add a shader mix shader node, and we can tell the shadow ray plugged into the factor, if it's a shadow, it will use the transparent BSDF. So let me show you what this does in the viewport. All right, this is straight from the principled BSDF, and then when we shift control click on the mix shader, the whole ocular region brightens up. So to me, this feels much more correct than the principled by itself. But technically we're venturing away from physical accuracy because that's what the principled BSDF claims. But as soon as we tell the shadows to be something different, we're not being physically accurate anymore. We are artistically directing, which I'm more than fine with. And the lens material especially is something I find always wanting to artistically direct. While I'm thinking about it, there is one other thing you can try. It does break physical accuracy, but it's worth a try. Shift control click on just the principled BSDF, and you can take your base color above 1. So let's go to like 1.5, and that will also brighten the ocular area. But as far as I understand it, it's kind of multiplying the light energy as if the light passes through the lenses and increases in power, which, you know, isn't really the way that works. You can also try, if we go back down to 1 there, I think you can make the transmission above 1 as well. Let's try that at 1.5. I didn't see a big difference. You can go above 1, but I'm not really seeing much in terms of increasing the lightness of the ocular area. So yeah, sometimes I will just try to increase the base color, but I find that a little less reliable. I don't like that it's multiplying the energy, but it's just one of those tools that I will try. And so let's go back to this mix shader, which effectively turns off shadows for the lens material. And let's do another version for comparison. Let's take a closer look, maximize the image editor. This is the shadow-free version. This is the shadowed version. Pretty big difference, at least in terms of illuminating the ocular region. However, let's compare to the no glasses version. I still really like the no glasses version. Now, I have committed to putting glasses on this character, or at least a version of this character. So I don't mean to suggest let's just lose the glasses, but I specifically don't like what this refractive material does to the other side. As I mentioned before, it really feels like it's flattening the objects behind it, especially this eye right here. It removes all of the specular reflection and almost reduces it to just the color data. I'm sure that's not what it's actually doing, but that's what it feels like. And that's a big sacrifice in my opinion. Also, the skin surrounding the eyeball. Without glasses, it's nice and speckled in terms of its reflection. Remember, we spent a lot of time getting that just right. And with the lenses, all of that kind of flattens out. The specular reflection diminishes significantly. So this commonly brings me to a crossroads whenever I'm trying to add glasses to a character between erring on the side of physical accuracy, which would be this material, versus venturing over into artistic liberty or artistic preference. However, before I show you the second version of this material, I want to do one more test in slot 4 with a simple glass BSDF. So Shift-A, shader, glass BSDF. This is one of the original BSDFs from when Cycles was first created. Its function is embedded inside of the principled BSDF, but this is the standalone version. So if I apply this to the lens, I'm curious if the shadows will look the same. So we'll make sure that the color is all the way up to 1, roughness is at 0. So this should be perfectly clear glass. We should be able to get a good feel just from the viewport alone. And actually, yeah, that looks exactly like the principled BSDF. So I'm glad I at least tested this, but it seems to confirm that they're using the same shader math under the hood. All right, so let's move on to the second version of the material. Let's add a fake user to this material and then duplicate it, and we'll call this lens_cheat. So that'll tell you that this is going to be a non-physically accurate cheating material, so to speak. We're going to get rid of the principled BSDF and instead add a glossy BSDF. Now we're going to take the transparent and use that as the foundation of the material. We'll put it in the first slot of the mix shader. We'll take the glossy BSDF, we'll set the color all the way up to 1 and the roughness down to 0. So this is a chrome metallic mirror-like reflections, and we're going to mix that not using the light path, but just using the factor. And we're going to keep it pretty low, like 0.05. All right, let's shift control click on that. And we're no longer using a refractive component. The transparent is just seeing straight through. And then we add a little bit of reflection on top of that, and the result ends up being fairly believable. In fact, for both of the portraits used in the teaser, both sets of glasses uses this version of the lens material instead of a physically accurate refractive version, and no one's called me out on it yet. So this is a secret between me and you. But I want to make sure to orbit around the viewport so that our reflections are clear and we can determine if the reflection level is too high or too low. I think 0.05 is a pretty good value. However, now that we are not using the principled BSDF, there's a physically accurate Fresnel component built into those reflections, which is not built into the glossy BSDF. So we should just go ahead and add that. Shift-A, add an input. We'll use layer weight. You've seen me use this prior to generate the soft effect for our hoodie. And we're going to use the same thing to determine the amount of reflections based on viewing angle. All right, so if you'll remember, we'll use the facing value. And if we're looking directly at the glasses from the front, they're going to be darker. But if we orbit off to the side, they're going to be lighter. And that's the way Fresnel works when it comes to reflections. And so I'm going to add a converter color ramp. This is how I used to add Fresnel to everything reflective in Cycles way back in the day. And I'm going to switch to B-spline. And let's just get a feel. I definitely want it from the front to be mostly black. And then as I start to orbit around, that should work out fine. The idea here is physically accurate, but the way I'm implementing it is totally artistic. And I've done this so many times, I just know it's going to work out. But this is also why you don't want to venture away from the principled BSDF unless you have to, because this is built in and you can trust it. And so once I have a good value set for our color ramp, I can determine what reflective value I want. I don't actually want it to turn to 0. I always want the lenses to be reflecting a little bit. So I'll take the value on the low end up from 0 to like 0.05. That's what we set in the mix shader, though I should probably go a little bit lower. How about 0.01? And then for the high end, we'll go down to 0.05. Because as I remember, that looks pretty shiny when I'm looking at an angle like this. You want these reflections to be lower than higher because you don't want the reflections to overtake the eye on the other side. And so we'll plug this in to the factor. And so I can confirm we still have reflections when looking at the grazing angles, but when looking directly from the front, our reflections are mostly gone. I'll have to do a full render to see if they're completely gone. I don't want that. I want there to be a little bit, but not too much. So let's do a new version. Switch to, let's see, we were on slot 3. I was going to do a glass BSDF render in slot 4, so we'll just replace that here. First, switch to solid view and render this. Okay, let's see what we have. All right, this is the refractive version. This is the cheat version. Refractive, cheat. We definitely have more dimension in the cheat version, because if we switch back to the no glasses version, it's 90% the same. We do get some shadows from the frames, which I can live with. That just makes sense. But overall, it's still got more fidelity in the shadows and in the speck reflections. The highlights of the eyes are still very strong. And personally, I prefer this method. I totally understand if it grinds your nerves knowing it's not physically accurate, and that it's definitely a cheat. So you're welcome to use whichever version you like. Though technically this version is a cheat too, since we turned off the shadows. But the non-cheating version, I think, looks the worst out of all three. So yeah, I'm going to stick with this version based on the transparent BSDF. And now I want to do a render from a 3/4 angle so that I can see how the reflections are holding up. So let's test that. We'll switch to slot 5, go back to previous, and I want to turn this head to look screen left. So let me find the timeline. Remember, we set up a camera control with a few keyframes, and I want to see what those are. So we have him turning the other way. So I'll go to frame 4 and rotate this way. We'll turn on rendered view so I can get an idea of the reflections. Yeah, something like this. Control B to box, select a new render region. Okay, this should be good. Let me set a frame, a rotational frame on the camera control. All right, now frame 4, we look the other direction. And let's see what this looks like. Yeah, I like the way those look. The reflections hold up nicely. So from the front to the side, that gives me an idea of how this will hold up in motion. And now the last thing I want to add is to make this imperfect. Currently, everything about the lens is pristine, and I want to add a little bit of dust and general breakup to the reflective component. So let's go back to previous. And the idea here is to add a diffuse BSDF. We'll select our glasses object, Shift A, shader, diffuse BSDF, and duplicate the mix shader. All right, so into this diffuse, which will represent the dust, right? There's not a reflective element to dust. Diffuse is all we need. And so we'll keep it simple by only controlling the color of the diffuse, but also the mix factor using an input, or no, texture, noise texture. All right. Control T to grab our texture coordinate. We don't need the mapping, and we'll use object coordinates. Shift Control, click on that, go to our rendered viewport, and a generic noise pattern should work perfectly for a subtle layer of dust. And we'll go to, let's say, 20 for the scale, 10 for the detail, and then roughness all the way up to 1. All right, the higher we go in the roughness, the more granular the pattern becomes. So again, granular dust kind of makes sense. And then from here, we'll add a converter color ramp, and we'll crush these values for some high contrast action. There we go. That should hold up well as dust. And the general idea will be plugging this into the factor. All right, so if we see what that looks like, it's going to be very, very dusty. Of course, I don't want the entire lens to be dusty like this. I just want to concentrate the dust in the corners. And so I need a vertex color group to do this. All right, we'll go to solid view, tab into edit mode, and I'm going to select the edges right on the corners of our lens. Control plus to grow the selection. Let's see, that's one too far. Switch to vertex mode. Okay, that's what I want. Now we'll go to vertex paint, and let's rename our vertex group to be dust underscore mask. We'll enable our paint selection mask, and when we add a new vertex color, it makes all the vertices white. So if I Control I to invert our selection, switch to the black color, Shift K, and then disable selection masking, you can see that the edges are white and the rest is black. Paint smooth vertex colors, and then probably do a little extra smoothing with the blur brush. Maybe turn our viewport lighting to be flat. I just want to make sure that this is nice and smooth. Okay, this should work out well. We'll go back to object mode, go back to studio lighting, rendered view, and to add the vertex color component, Shift A, input vertex colors, dirt mask. And let's Shift Control click on that. And then we'll want to add a color ramp. Let's just duplicate it from below. Switch to B-spline, and let's work out the fall off. We'll have to edit that manually, I'm sure, once we see how it's connected into the material. But I'm already kind of limiting the effect of the dust to the extreme edges of the lens. And then we will mix it, color mix RGB, multiplying the dust component over top of our dust mask, and switch the operation to multiply, strength up to 1. Okay, so now all the black of our dust texture is breaking up the white of the dust mask. All right, so let's see what this looks like plugged into the factor of our mix shader node down here. All right, we can see that lighter color start to appear at the edges. Might have to do a proper render to tell if it's too strong. I'm pretty sure it's too strong. But yeah, we'll have to do a proper render for comparison. So we'll switch to slot 6 and render. Okay, cool. That effect's not as strong as I thought it would be, which is good. I want it to be subtle, so let's see the before and after. You can see around the edges, it just lightens up in that sort of dust-like fashion. It's still maybe a little bit strong. I think especially when we address the material for the frames, it'll be more noticeable because the frames will be a darker color. But next to the default gray frame material, it doesn't seem as extreme. So I will want to tone that down. Again, I don't want to give the impression that these glasses have been sitting in an attic for a couple years, but primarily I know from being a glasses wearer that just a little bit of dust and grime tends to gather in the crevices. So that's kind of what I'm implementing here, an effort to make it imperfect ever so slightly. But it's also not something that should be noticeable primarily. It's just one of the many aspects of a portrait that make it feel believable, whereas if it's a completely perfect, pristine surface, that's going to ruin the believability rather than a little bit of dust. So I'm going to dial down the amount of dust by half and then add an overall breakup to the roughness reflectivity. So let's switch to slot 7, and I'm going to dial down the amount of the dust here in this color ramp. Instead of the upper value being 1, we'll take it down to 0.5. And then as far as breaking up the roughness, let's use our noise texture here. We'll duplicate it, Shift Control D, although I probably should have just added a reroute instead. And this will be plugged into the roughness of our glossy BSDF. So let's take a look. We don't want it to be exactly the same as the one we duplicated. And we also don't need it to be quite so dusty. So we can take down the roughness from 1 to like 0.7, let's say. Also increase the distortion to like 0.5. Maybe take up the scale to like 50. Let's adjust our color ramp. I want it to be fairly high contrast. And maybe mostly black than white. Yeah, something like this. Distortion's maybe a touch high. Let's go to like 0.3. And what I want to do is add to the roughness value, which is set to 0. So, well, I guess I don't need to add that. I can just control that with this color flag, and we'll make the high value like 0.1. And we should be able to see how this affects our glossy BSDF directly in the viewport. So let's turn this on and off. Or actually, I'm going to have to disconnect it. What did I plug that into? The color or the roughness? Okay, it must have been the color. All right, so that's actually not that effective. Maybe I need to be at a higher value. Just for the sake of demonstration, the higher we go, all the way up to like, what is this, 0.8? 0.583. You can see how the reflection is broken up. That's essentially all I want to do. It's going to serve to sort of be like maybe fingerprints or something, just not perfectly pristine reflections. All right, so let's unplug that to see before and after. I'm not completely convinced that the values are correct, but let's see what it looks like in the material. Looks like it's going to be a little too fingerprint-ish. So maybe we'll take down the upper flag to like 0.3. All right, that should be the final aspect of the lens material. Let's do a comparison and see if we like it. One more final look. So this is before. The dust is stronger. The reflections are not broken up. And here the reflections are broken up. The dust is a little bit more subtle. Let's flip back and forth a few times. Yeah, I think that's going to work out well. As always, I expect to come back and tweak these as needed. But these breakup components, or imperfect components, both in the reflections and in the dust, is mostly useful for animated sequences. I don't really expect them to be noticeable in a still frame by themselves. If they were, that would be an indication that they're too strong. So this is definitely an exercise in subtlety, maybe more so than other things we've done in the portrait so far. But now it's time to move on to the glasses frame material.